This is Warren Vanderhill with the Center for Middletown Studies project on faith communities in Muncie, and today I'm talking to the Reverend Dr. Pat Smith, the interim pastor of First Presbyterian Church. The date is June 19th, 2017. First, I want to begin by thanking you for agreeing to participate in our project.
Thrilled to be invited.
But I want you to begin with the very personal part of this, and that go put on the Wayback Machine and tell me about your own personal faith journey back there somewhere and then ending up here at First Presbyterian in Muncie, Indiana.
Well, we can do it in two ways, perhaps. One of those is kind of geographic and family. So grew up going to church almost every Sunday that I can remember. So church background in the old Southern Presbyterian Church, and that group reunited with the Northern Presbyterian Church that First Presbyterian Church Muncie was a part of in 1983. So those two groups came together. But I'm one of those people who's been in a church worship service almost every Sunday of my whole life. The last 36 years, as I sometimes say, because I get paid to do it, but it's also deeply personal and a very personal thing for me to worship God. So I grew up with that in my background. Born in 1954, so came through the heyday of church life in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Professionally, since those roots were in the South, a little bit in New York when I was growing up, but professionally out of seminary in 1981, ended up serving churches in Atlanta, Georgia, Knoxville, Tennessee, in Indiana for the first time in 1990 for 13 years, in a county seat town, First Presbyterian Church over in the western part of the state, Montgomery, Alabama, also as a senior pastor level, and then in 2006 became a staff member at Zionsville Presbyterian Church, so a suburban growing part of Indianapolis. Once from that position, after 8 years, went to be an interim pastor on the east end of Long Island, New York, and was there for almost 3 years, and now here in Indiana, again in Muncie.
Did you go to college in Tennessee?
Went to college in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee State University. It was in my hometown. It was a natural fit, mostly because I was dating a girl a year older than me, so I thought that's probably the right thing to do.
Okay.
But it was a great fit, so I also was very involved in church life through my college years. I'm not one of those who took a break for a while because I went off to school or anything else. So almost literally every Sunday of my life, I've been in worship someplace.
Then go beyond that. Where'd you go to seminary? And I know you did your doctoral work.
Yeah, did seminary work about a year after I finished college, and did that in Deerfield, Illinois, part of Chicago. The far north shore of Chicago. Was there for 3 years. And during those 3 years, also interned as a seminary intern in a local Presbyterian church in Lake Forest, Illinois, up on the North Shore. Coming out of seminary, that was in 1981, and started my first church that I served was in the Atlanta, Georgia area.
Okay. What do you see as your main responsibilities at First Presbyterian?
My main responsibility, because I'm interim, we call them intentional transitional pastors. Okay. We've come to know in our PCUSA, our denomination, that really all ministry is transitional. We just don't always think of it that way. But in this role as interim, it's a kind of a combination of things. One, it's a placekeeper from one chapter in ministry to another. So almost any warm body will do to be the pastor during an intentional interim time. This one happens to be a little bit longer than average for us, so it's expected to be about 3 years, give or take half a year. And with that also comes some expectations that it's not just placeholding, it's also looking back at who the church has been, who the church is now, and who the church believes it's called to be for the future. So some of the things that I bring to the table are the opportunity to be in, kind of the figure of a wagon master. I've been asked to come alongside a group of people who are traveling together into the future. So there's a little bit of a futurist in my role. There's a little bit of a consultant in my role. I refer to it as an embedded consultant. Most consultations are done a few weekends a year or a few phone calls or whatever it might be, but this is long term. This is every day. So part of my role also, as I see it, and some interims don't, but I see it as fully investing myself as if I am the long-term pastor, but knowing that I'm here just for several years. So it's a leadership role that comes alongside people in their journey, and this church, like all churches, has been through a journey. And so particular to our journey, I get to bring basically everything that I've come to know and understand about my own faith in God and my own walk with Jesus, to bring it to bear as a leader and servant and companion to the people of this church, so that we can go from where we are now to where we're headed into the future, ready for a call to a new pastor as I finish up.
Okay. How would you characterize the condition of this church right now?
Relatively strong. We are strong in the sense that we can financially support the ministry that we currently have. We've made some adjustments over the last year before I got here with some staffing. We went through a bit of a struggle about a year ago here before my arrival, actually about a year and a half ago, that meant some people left this congregation that were major contributors and major investors in time and giving. Just the last wave of some changes in regard to that over the last 20 years or so here at First Presbyterian. So we are able to maintain our ministry well. We have what I would say are still shrinking numbers that have been shrinking since, I'm guessing, somewhere in the 80s, and ministries continued on effectively. Tremendous strengths in certain areas, mission to the community, mission to the world, some really great partnerships through the years here with ministry around the world. Tremendous music ministry, both of a traditional sort, almost a high church sort of music ministry, but also some good, more contemporary kinds of music as well for a congregation like this. Not as strong as it would, they'd not be considered as strong in other churches as they are here, but good mix in all of that. A number of people who have long-standing relationships with each other who are part of this church, and so those relationships are a plus and part of our vitality. We're also entering into, because of this interim time, a very careful look at where we've been and who we are now. So that question alone that you've asked is a vital question for who we're going to become, not just who we've been.
This may be a little bit unfair, but do you have a number, if I were to say, how many members did they have here, let's say, in the 80s, since you threw in the 1980?
Again, more in my memory is picking up anecdotally kind of memory. So it's not as if I've been here 10 years to comment on a long-term understanding. But the best understanding I have comes through somebody who said that in the early 80s, there were 700 to 800 people worshiping here. We are now are about a couple of hundred, give or take 20 on a given Sunday. So somewhere in the 200 range, plus or minus. So that alone is an indicator of tremendous change in the last 20 to 30 years.
When you get to that number of 200 and you come in this interim responsibility, is that, well, I guess I'm calling this chasing a number. How much of a challenge is it for a pastor who comes in, say, even with a 3-year interim position, and you've got 200, 250 people? How important is it to look at that number and say, I have to get that number up to, let's say, 400 or something like that?
Great question, and that's not something that's ever fueled me to get to that next number that we've got to have. Much more important to me is the heart of the people, is individual lives. It's, are we encouraging one another to live out the faith that we've been given, not only for an individual's sake, but for the sake of the world around us. So of much greater importance to me is spiritual vitality, is spiritual, I'll call it maturity, but also through friendship circles and neighborhood circles, are there people who might be encouraged to look at faith in God and come to be a part of a ministry and to investigate what life with God could really look like for them personally. So mission's really important, and I don't mean by that just a mission committee, but the idea that we're called to be followers of
Right,
Jesus 24/7. And that kind of life is the life that's on my mind most. It's not the numbers. It's not, as we might refer to it, the ABCs. It's not attendance, building, and cash, although attendance, building, and cash all help to make ministry function.
Yeah.
The most important thing is people and relationships and people growing, coming to know God, and also living a life of faith, hopefully in meaningful, deeply meaningful ways.
So there is no charge from a Presbyterian to say to someone like you, well, you're going in there for, let's say, 3 years, and you got to get those numbers up.
No.
Okay.
I suppose if we were in crisis point with numbers,
Yeah.
there'd be some conversations about what we can do just in that formula of if there aren't people in the seats, in the pews, something needs to be done to change that.
Okay.
But I rather think that if we emphasize ministry that is meaningful, numbers will begin to be generated because people are finding deep and rich meaning in a life of faith. Doesn't always hold true. In our day and time around the country, we've got churches, especially in the old line denominations like the PCUSA, generally shrinking numbers dramatically. And with that, that means, okay, so how do we work that formula? But if it's really about meaningful heart connection to God, so where's the proof? Are the numbers really increasing? And in a lot of places, they're not.
Yeah. Aside from membership, if one can indeed go aside from membership for a minute, what are the other main challenges that this particular church faces at this point in its history?
Right now, one of the most important things that is actually what drew me here was a sense not only of spiritual vitality and whatever I might be able to bring to that, knowing that there's been a rich history of spiritual vitality before me, but what we can bring to that. But it's also surrounding the idea of how we can help with some healing out of some of the difficulties that we faced over the last couple of years. And I'm using the pronoun we because I feel fully invested in that, not just as an outsider. So every opportunity we can bring to help people resolve some of the questions they had about some of the difficulties that were faced in the last couple of years, that's part of this as well. It's also a positioning. It's not really about me. It's about a positioning with what we can discover about our context in North American life, how that impacts Muncie and the greater Delaware County area, and what that will mean for us as a congregation. So if we can live with an attentiveness to the cultural context in which we've been placed, not just the cultural context of 20 years ago. We can't just, in my view anyway, moving through this transition period, it would be a negative, I suppose. It would be not quite what I'm hoping for or what I think perhaps God might intend at this time if we simply kind of regurgitated what we said 20 years ago to describe our ministry or our place in our world right now. So we really need to do some hard work of opening up ourselves to what's going on culturally, what's our own specific church history, what might God be stirring us to consider that might help us to build a strong ministry that looks different, perhaps, but maybe still holds on to the greater, deeper values that this church has held for a long time. So the critical question is, how do we examine that as forthrightly as we can and as honestly as we can? And that's tricky.
No,
That's not an easy thing.
No, it isn't. What role do you see for First Presbyterian in the wider community of Muncie?
I think there's a tremendous heritage here in terms of reputation as being one of the larger middle class, upper class churches in the community, connected to people of means more than the other half of the community. So that legacy is a huge legacy. It's also a legacy that can sometimes get in the way of some of the things that we really do care about and feel about. I've heard people have said to me over my 9 months here that, oh yeah, that's the Cadillac Church.
Yeah, Our Lady of the Cadillac.
There we go. That's even better. So we certainly still have people of means who are part of this church, and that is part of our identity. I think that can be a strength and not a weakness. And it's been a strength for decades and decades and decades. This church has really played a vital role within the life of the community. So I think some of that challenge and opportunity is both to celebrate who we've been in the past, who we still are, and develop whatever new sense of identity and calling we can to be known for really serving the cause of Jesus with all people in all places in our community and this part of Indiana.
This may be a little unfair because you haven't been here that long, but you are certainly aware that in the last few decades, Muncie has experienced really incredible economic and social changes.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've been here long enough to tell me how you see ways in which those kinds of economic and social changes have impacted First Presbyterian.
A few clues, I think, that I picked up. A couple of those clues are that our membership has shifted pretty dramatically from 30 years ago. And again, that's not uncommon in all communities around North America. Old line churches and others go through periods of decline and increase. But overall, we've seen, for instance, in our PCUSA denomination, we've seen numbers shrinking through my 3 decades of ministry, 3.5 decades of ministry. So it's not an uncommon story. But if we factor that in as a greater cultural context in North America, while some churches are growing and some denominations are growing, many of them are shrinking. It's almost like there's this drumbeat of impending doom that someday in the next 20 to 30 years will look a lot like Europe more than North America, where 2% of the population are in a church on any given Sunday. But here in Muncie directly with the shifts, I think there's evidence for me that we've seen management level and next tier down. Those numbers have dropped in our community. We haven't actually, from my viewpoint, picked up lots of people who have traditionally come to First Presbyterian Church. We've got Ball Memorials still here as part of IU Health. We've got the university. But besides those two, there's not much that's drawing those who would have traditionally been attracted to a facility like ours, just driving down the street, the type of worship we tend to have, those kinds of things have shifted as well. Doesn't mean that people of lesser means can't find a home in a church like ours, but it's a little more daunting to drive up to a big brick facility like ours that has doors that seem to be more closed than open. And so it's a little daunting to think, well, yeah, we could go worship there if that's not been someone's background. So it has to do with background in other parts of the country. It also has to do with what shaped Muncie directly. We've seen an impact here in terms of giving through the years that would be impacted by those kinds of changes as well. So all of that, I think, makes a difference. When I mentioned the hospital and the university, I'm told that more and more people who come to be part of faculty administration of both of those entities, that folks who are of, again, the traditional draw that's been a part of First Pres's life over most of its history, that most of them are not living in Muncie. They're out in the county. They're commuting from Northwest Indianapolis. So there just aren't that many of that more traditionally connected people who would easily come to town and say, oh, a First Pres, I'd love to go check them out. That's the kind of church that I'm looking for.
Do you think it's fair to say that there are indeed members of this congregation who have had their lives impacted by these economic and social changes in Muncie?
Definitely. I see that in terms of friendship circles. I hear people talking about the loss of friends, people who've left town. There's been a loss because of that sense that we're a shrinking church rather than a growing church. So for us as an organization, as a congregation, there's a sense of decline and a sense of things contracting rather than growing. We've seen it in terms of the number of young families who are part of this ministry, and that's a great indicator of how things have shifted in the last 20 years, where now we have about 12 families with children from cradle to through high school. We used, even 10 years ago, we would have had 20 families at least, and beyond that, 30 and 40 families with children of that age group.
Can you give me some examples of specific ways in which First Presbyterian is now involved in the greater Muncie community? Things you do as outreach?
Yeah, there are historically, and again, 9 months in, still learning some of it, but historically there are ministries that reach out to all parts of the community that we're engaged in, some of them with really vibrant partnerships. Sometimes we are the primary funders of some of those ministries. So that goes for church and Christian ministries as it does for community organizations. One of our pluses is that we've got so many people who are so engaged in different parts of the community, from the arts to foundations to things completely behind the scenes to workplaces. So we have both the official line items in a budget, but that shows connection for virtually every part of the Muncie area still. In terms of both giving and people being involved. I'd say percentage-wise, a fairly small percentage are active investors, hands-on, but still dozens of people who are actively engaged hands-on in ministry throughout the area. We also see it in terms of those more civic levels, people involved in all kinds of organizations. And that makes a tremendous difference as well, because it's not just about ministry that's got the word Christian on it. It's about community investment and involvement.
Well, I guess I was looking for, this is a prompt, because I've talked to the lieutenant, and that is things like the Salvation Army. I mean, I guess, because that is a really significant commitment.
It's a very big
And looking at it from the Salvation Army standpoint, when the Lieutenant Taube said to me, well, I don't know if we could really do the work we do without the First Presbyterian Church.
Yes.
And I gather that's something that's of long standing.
It is, and and I don't know how far back that relationship goes, but there are, I hear that actually almost every few weeks from some organization in town, especially some ministry group that is dependent on gifts and churches being involved, that First Pres has been a tremendous help. And people get nervous when they think about First Pres, perhaps as we reevaluate ministry and wondering whether or not they can count on our gifts. For some of those organizations, a huge gift is a few $1,000s a year. For some of them, it's $20,000. And so we have everything from a few thousand to $30,000 that we've been investing and still investing in ministries in this community.
As you look toward the future, and I know you're certainly doing that this week, perhaps more than previous weeks,
Yes.
Do you see the opportunity for First Presbyterian to engage in more of those kinds of activities, like the relationship with the Salvation Army?
I do. I think it's going to be one of the key questions is strategically what a fair number of churches in our day and time are assessing, and that is it going wide and getting involved in as many things as we're led to do through as many contacts as we can develop, or is it going deep with fewer contacts and fewer investments? It's the more bang for a buck kind of thing. So that's something that we have to determine. But I don't see anything shifting the regard that this community, that this church has had for its community. So I believe that can lead to even greater investment of time and abilities and financial giving. And actually, one of the things we're exploring just in the last few weeks, fueled by some of our mission leaders, is the idea that we might be able to play a role because of our heritage and because of the kind of gifted people we have in our congregation, that we can actually come alongside ministries that might be floundering a bit, not really gaining traction, and offer them something even far beyond financial support and personal investment as a day-to-day, week-to-week investor, like with Habitat or countless other ministries. But that we could actually bring to bear the kind of leadership gifts and skills and organizational gifts and skills and foundation gifts and skills from every walk of life within our current congregation that might be a new and unique gifting to some of these organizations that could help them to rethink things strategically, and we could walk alongside them in some vibrant ways that could actually help them to grow and maximize their ministries even more. That's kind of a new wrinkle.
Is it fair or too premature to ask you to perhaps comment on relationships that I know we've talked about with, say, Grace Episcopal or other denominational groups, other ethnic groups? Because I know you have this really vibrant, long-time ministry with the Korean congregation.
We do. That's shaped before I got here over the last few years as describing itself as an international congregation, which is a kind of a key step.
Yeah.
It's no longer just
Yeah.
for those who are Korean speaking or in terms of first language. It is increasing. I see both on the basis of already some great relationships in the area from the Whiteley community and others, again, mostly through interpersonal connections and relationships of our people. Since I've been here, we've been involved in an annual dinner for interreligious group here, and that's across the board. We've attended some events that have been events like that, so I've been investing in some of those relationships in a fresh way. Glad to keep pursuing that personally, which I think helps me and helps me grow and be stronger, but also helps to build some of those bridges on the basis of everything else we've done too. We also have an interesting development where a Chinese congregation has approached us just in the last month about utilizing almost our whole facility on Friday nights for a university-connected ministry that could be tremendously helpful to them. And I think that's an awesome thing to keep intentionally opening up our doors to people of all backgrounds as God might lead us to do.
But you would say that part of your way of looking at this church at this point in its history is that you need to reach out to work with other groups and with other churches in the Muncie community.
Yes, at least that's a personal conviction, but I think it's also a conviction that I hear from our people here. We went through a period in the last few years where I understand that idea kind of shrank a little bit, that the doors tended to be more closed to other groups than open. And if that's reliable, if that information is correct, and I'm always cautious to make sure I'm hearing the right thing, but there is a real intent to have our doors open more. And we've already taken some key steps in the 9 months I've been here to do that some more. All the way from community concerts to we are a gathering place for families that are in transition related to court system. So we have families meeting here in some of our rooms dozens of times a week to work on visitation schedules. So all the way from things that nobody sees to more the big picture things. There's a much greater emphasis on open door and how that could serve our community and be a role that's a great role for us.
And I think the church has always been very accepting and open to addiction groups that meet here.
Yep, we have a couple of those groups that meet with us now. They expanded from one meeting a night to two, one of those groups, Narcotics Anonymous, I think. So again, a variety of things that we help with. Again, specifically, we were mentioning Salvation Army, but we can run the list from food ministries, meal ministries, Whiteley Connections, Habitat for Humanity, Home Savers. I just sat in on a meeting of that, some of the board members of that just in the last few days. Again, a great heritage that's long-lasting, and that connection seems so strong, and we need to keep doing what we can to evaluate where can those strengths be utilized best. That's part of what's going to help make us stronger, I think, as the years unfold.
Yeah, I would agree. I want to switch a little bit because of where you've been. Atypically, of a lot of the people I've spoken with in this project, you've been in a lot of different places in a lot of different parts of the country.
Yes, it can sound like I can't hold a job.
No,
Yes,
that's
thank
not
you.
true. But with that in mind, why do you think that membership numbers in the mainline churches began to decline a few decades ago? I mean, why, as you look back from a historical perspective, is there a reason, or are there reasons why you think that happened as you reflect on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I'm an amateur historian, so I wish I was more adept at an answer. I think there have been, we went through incredible shifts in the 60s and 70s in our country. And that absolutely impacted the life of faith in all different faiths. Certainly within Christianity, certainly within the Presbyterian Church USA. Our denomination's been focused on conversations, for instance, about race and sexuality. My whole lifetime, but particularly coming through the 60s and 70s. So we've had, at our national level, official conversations about how we view those issues from a biblical perspective, a historical perspective. And each of those challenges that come in our society either helps faith life become more meaningful to people or less meaningful for people. And largely, at least on the heels of, again, mainline, what I refer to and others have as old line denominations, those issues and plenty of others in terms of how we read the Bible, how we understand our historic faith, shifts that have been dramatic starting in the 60s. World War II and after was tremendous boom years for churches, but we also came out of that within 2 decades already starting to feel convoluted and things being in an uproar. And that's not something that came completely apart from our society. It came because of our society in which we live. Personal life and issues of our personal lives. So we can deal with things like the economy of the country, the politics of the country, government, social issues. All of those things have made an impact on the life and health of faith, especially as I know it within Christianity.
Is this true, again, given your travels, your geographic knowledge here, pretty much true across the country as far as the decline of mainline denominations?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And a lot of communities and churches think, oh, it's just happening to us.
Right.
No, it's not.
Okay.
On the other hand, we see tremendous growth in certain sectors of Christianity. Here in Muncie, lots of stories I hear of churches that are going strong. They've got hundreds and hundreds of people. Lots of young families. They're bursting at the seams. So and that's also true around the country. There are ministries that are thriving. There are ministries that are diminishing, and a lot of theory and a lot of books and a lot of convictions based around that. Even in my 3.5 decades of ministry.
Well, I want to pick up on that, and you can guess where I'm going with this because we've had other conversations about it. What do you see, I know this is true in your own family as it is in mine, as the appeal of megachurches?
That's fascinating. I have started boiling it down to, and I'm sure in an inaccurate way, but I boil it down to, number one, excitement breeds excitement. So just like back in the 50s, mainline churches, they were fully going enterprises. People were attracted. You were expected to go to church. That was the way our culture was built. Certainly, there were lots of people who didn't. But that's what we carry with us. So here we are now, 60 years later, and there have been waves of change that have attracted people. Sometimes it's about personality. So, and our culture has tended more toward personality-driven in everything we do. Get the next great CEO. If the personality's right, everybody's on board. Get the next artist in entertainment. It's totally personality-driven. Same thing with some churches. An expectation of a conference-style speaker, someone who's one of the A speakers. You get somebody like that. So we see shifts that can be attractive to some of the mega churches because they're built around a person and an identity, someone generally who's there for a long time, and that ministry grows and prospers because of their culture and their style and their temperament. We've also got a shift that I refer to, and again, not demeaning these ministries that are flourishing, but in my experience, what I see is both an appeal to not only based on the personality of a key leader, but also a conference-style speaking. So it's about a stage, it's about lighting, it's about arrangement in a theater style, it's about plush seating, it's about the things that we all have grown to know and understand about going to big conferences. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, sure there were conferences, but those are big ticket items now in all stages of life. So people who are used to conference speakers used to a TED Talk style of teacher.
Right.
Every word's precise. There are no notes, that kind of thing. So the appeal that most megachurches have grown into is that kind of style. The other piece of that is not just conference speaker style, but also the kind of music that's offered.
Yeah.
And in my generation, we began to go to a lot more concerts, and that certainly blossomed in my children's generation. So it is the appeal of a great stage band, great musicians, amazing sounds, loud sounds for the most part, although they're really great and adept at bringing that into play, just like a concert would be. So that kind of thing appeals to a culture that we've generated that's conference-oriented, that's stage-oriented, that something's going up in front of us that may not necessarily engage us all that much. For instance, in some of the larger churches that I've had the privilege of attending through the years and being a part of worship in those settings, it seems to me that the real sound in singing, in a block of singing that might be a set of 5 to a dozen songs that fills up the first half of the experience.
Like your use of the word set.
It's like a concert. So here's this mini concert, and it's really so much about the concert that it doesn't necessarily mean we who are in the room are actually singing all that much. Okay. Because again, that identity, I'm at a concert more than I'm in what would be referred to as a old style worship where voices were important. Stage band presence is not that important. And so the appeal really fits the culture. And yet it's fascinating that some people in younger generations find themselves occasionally speaking of hungering for something that is different. They've grown up within it. So occasionally, we've got a guy in his mid to late 20s who said when he first attended here a couple of years ago, he said, I was attracted to the idea of a quote-unquote contemporary band-driven service early in the morning in a traditional sanctuary. I'm going, wow, what kind of an incredible mix is that in one guy? And he's hanging out again based on some of the things that means to him. But we also have known of traditional settings of worship, even much higher worship than we have here at First Pres. Extremely traditional, very regimented and organized according to a style that doesn't vary Sunday to Sunday, with a litany and liturgy that's all pretty much the same every week, with traditional music, traditional ways of walking through worship, that for some of my children's generation, and they're in their mid-30s right now, some of them find themselves hungering for that. I don't know if that's because what they've experienced seems somehow not as rich as they thought it would, or whether they've just come out of different backgrounds. By the way, I think that number's relatively small. So mega churches, I think all of those things make a difference. The other piece that I think has been big for them, for those churches, and for some old line churches that are vibrant and strong, is that some of them tend to focus not just on a worship experience like I've described, but they also encourage people, in fact almost require people to be engaged in smaller relational groups so that relationships are being built. It's not just dropping in on Sunday or Saturday or Friday for a big experience. It's also expected that they're in relationship with people meeting in homes or at other locations.
Okay, that's good. Very well done. Well said. I'm making the assumption, going back maybe a decade or two, that the mainline church's use of praise services or contemporary services was an attempt to try to bridge the kinds of things you're talking about in a congregation.
Totally.
And so let's just have this form of worship, but we're also going to have this form of worship. And I've spoken to a number of people in our study and said, well, you too, that this runs the risk, at least, of creating two congregations.
Absolutely.
So you think that's a valid...
Totally.
Okay.
Yes, people here at First Pres talk about not knowing who else is part of the life of the church, or that we're in this congregation. And it absolutely does that. I think it probably, there's the law of unintended consequences when probably in the 80s that really started to hit big.
Right.
I was in a Presbyterian church in western part of Indiana that had a little garden service in the summer that they had done something with for a few years when I got there. And within those next few years, we decided to try to do that year round. There was enough that we were beginning to build with it. And we made that step. So we took it indoors and for fall and winter and spring. And when we did that, within a few Sundays, someone came up to me, one of the older members of that church, and said, "Okay, what's gone wrong?" And I said, "Now tell me what you're talking about." And she said, "Well, gosh, I think I'm missing a lot of my friends. They've all left. Where are they?" I said, "Oh, no. Okay, you remember that second service we started talking about doing year round? There are about 100 of your friends who are in that service who were there this morning." And that helped her, but all of a sudden, she knew that she'd lost 100 of her friends from worship. There are some churches that have gone the route. I'm sure there are some here in Muncie that have gone the route of blending music styles.
Yeah, right.
And that also is a kind of a funny thing in my experience because it can sort of leave almost everybody disgruntled because, wow, I don't like that style of music, but I guess I have to put up with it in order to get my style of music and come to worship. Again, the law of unintended consequences. Of course, all of those decisions were made by people who loved people, loved the faith, wanted to help people come to know God and to live increasingly for Christ. But there are all these other things that happen along with it. And finding people beginning to feel like they're in two separate congregations is part of that reality.
But you've got to find some way to try to bridge that, I would assume.
Yes. And most people usually think of that as give us some experiences where we are together intentionally.
Right.
So I think this church that I'm serving now was at one point doing, when there was a fifth Sunday in a month, let's bring everybody together. And people speak of that wistfully, like that was a wonderful thing, and I'm sure it was. There are unintended consequences with that. So there are people who arrive for worship and all of a sudden it's at a different time and they leave that Sunday because they don't know when worship's going to happen. Plus that thing of when we blend, is it as fully engaging as we hoped it would be, and sometimes not. But some of that comes too without it being on Sundays or worship times. Does a church provide meaningful opportunities for people to be together for dinners or special events or concerts or whatever it might be, or service to the community?
The question that we've been using that has a kind of lofty academic imprimatur to it is this one. So I want you to reflect on this a little bit. What role do you think that churches have in cultivating what I'm going to initially call, and then there's a second part of the question, a sense of citizenship? Do you think that that is an important role in contemporary American society for churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. I pondered it a little. My first thought is that we certainly used to be that way. When we think of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, mainline churches, there was that sense that citizenship was the prevailing, our country is all, the flag is everything. We are citizens of our country. So historically, that was huge at that time. We've lived through times where that's gotten rocked in a huge way. So there are churches that still see themselves as heavily involved politically. In our denomination, I would tend to see that some of our more progressive churches that have been engaged more. Interestingly, outside of some of the mainline churches, we see it among the more conservative. What we were hearing in the last election cycle as the evangelicals, which is really a poor lumping together because they're evangelicals all across the board. So just as there are of every other type of person that might label themselves a certain way politically or in terms of faith. So we actually still see, I think, still a tremendous investment for people in terms of a sense of civic duty out of faith and bringing faith to civic duty. It just takes different forms in different places among different groups. There are some pastors who major on, let's talk about the issues of our day. I happen to be more of a pastor who believes our role My role in particular is one that I'm comfortable with, knowing the implications of what we talk about in preaching and teaching and time with people, when we're talking about how we grow in a faith that then makes a difference and spills over into our communities and our country, that it springs out of what we talk about in terms of faith, but that becomes each person's own application place. Where do I take what I'm learning, what I'm hearing? How does that make a difference in my life, in my workplace, in my family, in my school, in all other areas of life, including my life as a citizen of our country? One of the fascinating things that we've seen shift too is not only because of the 60s and 70s, but we've seen a shift in understanding what citizenship looks like and sounds like. And when we do that, that reshapes. Is it my country only, or is it all countries? Is there worth in other countries that I was only thinking about for myself in my own country? So all of those things end up shaping what does it mean to live by faith no matter where we live.
Okay, well, then jump to this, which is my last question. Do you think there's a connection between faith and citizenship?
I do. There's a fascinating line in Scripture, for instance, that tells us that as people of faith in Christ, we are citizens of a different kingdom. So this is in a little bit of an angle that will lead me to the more practical about country, global geopolitical entities. So it is a fascinating calling, I believe, we have scripturally as Christians to recognize that wherever we live, we are first and foremost citizens of the kingdom of God. And that has no boundaries. There are no geopolitical boundaries. And in that way, that really can reshape where does allegiance lie. If my first allegiance is to God, then my first allegiance can't also be to country, not exactly in the same way. At the same time, faith and Scripture for Christians affirms we need to be respecters of authority, and that means geopolitical authorities as well. So there are absolutely dynamics at work that for people of faith, we are to be invested in our communities, in our nation, and in our world as global citizens, national citizens, state citizens, community citizens, to the best of our ability, living out our faith, not just talking about Jesus, but really living a faith that makes a difference within the civic life.
Those are all the formal questions I have, but at the end of our interviews, I always give the person I'm speaking with an opportunity to add anything that he might wish. So here's your opportunity to have a postscript, if you will, if you desire to have one of any kind.
Thank you. One of the things I would say immediately is that within the Middletown studies, as I've come to know them, both through you and others and readings, also remembering I knew about this back in my college days, it's been fascinating to come to be a part of the greater Muncie area, because I think there are dynamics at work that still make Muncie a Middletown in that way. And I love the opportunity that you and others have provided to do this particular study, because related to civic life and faith life, the two can't be separated. We're pretty good in our country of talking about separation of church and state, and I get that, and there's tremendous value in not having a state-sponsored religion. I love that we're a country that welcomes people of all faiths, and that we can do that here in Muncie. And I also love the opportunity to examine what is being shaped for community life and how church life, not just as organizations, but as true living faith, how that really makes a difference in the people of our community. The people that we touch as First Pres, the people that are touched by countless other churches in the area as well. I think there's tremendous value in thinking about where we are now as a community and where our churches are now that can be show even greater partnership, greater investment, greater life that benefits everybody, churches and community, in fresh and good ways. In a time frame in which you're doing this interview, there's in very short supply a sense of community collegiality, community cooperation, real life between races and beliefs, economic levels, and every way that things can seem to be pulling apart in our country and in our communities. And Muncie is part of that.
Yeah.
Isn't it wonderful to consider that there could be ways that even this project could help bring a sense of renewed interest and connection to a great community that has great challenges, and with great churches that also have great challenges, and see what might get generated. So love the opportunity to speak into that a little bit. You and I have had plenty of conversations on the side, and who knows what's stirring. But tremendous gratitude for all of that.
Well, I really appreciate that, because now you're part, having dropped into Muncie at this point in time, of the ongoing research of the most studied community in the United States.
Yes, it hasn't been something that I've missed. That even First Presbyterian, at this point in time, could be seeing, depending on how things are shaped for us, in my interim period here over these next several years, that we could see that what we're shown and what we're able to evaluate and do might be kind of a Middletown study for old line First Presbyterians and other denominations around the country. That said, without any sense of, oh my goodness, I can't wait to make sure this happens, but it just is an intriguing possibility that what we're able to do becomes a microcosm for the greater world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Yeah.